So, Talia, good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's conference. It's great to have you here and great for you to be able to present to our audience from around the world. So, if you would just tell us a little bit about yourself and we'll just sit back and let you take it.
Awesome. So today I'll be talking to you about audience-centric approach to content creation. Just a little bit about me before I get started. I'm the principal of the Urban Nomad. It's a boutique tourism consulting firm focusing on content strategy, and I've been doing that work for about 4 years. Prior to that, I was the manager of content and social media for Brand USA. If you're not familiar with Brand USA is the official tourism marketing organizations for the United States. If you're familiar a little bit with it, it is overseen by the Department of Commerce and funded by visa waiver fees for international travelers. So I manage the properties visittheusa.com in 8 languages and 15 countries for several years before going out on my own. Currently, I work internationally with many destinations, including tribal nations in the US. I'm working on a project right now in Madagascar, doing digital tourism trainings there. I just finished a project in Belize, which actually I'll talk about, and I work with a couple of destinations here in the US in the Upper Peninsula, as well as other places. I was there in DC for many years, 10 years actually, where I met my husband, who was in the Navy for 20 years and actually recently retired during COVID. And after he retired, we decided to move back to California to be close to my family. Because we had a baby, and so we wanted, the extra help. I also speak French and Arabic for those of you who are international and might be deployed in other markets where you might have to communicate in multiple languages. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like for you, but I can understand that that might be an additional challenge, and I try to bring that into my work and thinking about who your target audience is. And if you want to reach me, I know this is recorded, but my email address is right there, Talia at the Urban Nomad, and I'm at the Urban Nomad on all social platforms. So I look forward to hearing from you. And here is my website at the bottom. So today we'll be talking about defining your target audience, developing your content strategy, deploying your content, a little bit about measurement, which could be a class all on its own, but just to touch base on that. And then we'll have some time for questions. So at the end of today, you'll be thinking about these questions, and I want you to be thinking about them during the presentation because I won't be there to talk to you. So pretending that this is interactive, you want to think about who your audience is, what they want to know, where to reach them, which is probably the topic of a lot of other sessions, but what channels they were on, when to reach them. I always like to start with why you're doing this work. So you're not just communicating things because your boss told you to, but there should be a reason and a strategy behind that work. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to get that done. But in any messaging strategy, when we want to think about these 6 questions, so who, what, where, when, why, and how. And I always like to start with the why, so that's how I'll be opening things up. So going into starting out about defining your audience, that's really who you're talking to. The audience is your customer because you're not a business selling things. They're your stakeholder and they're sort of your client in the case of communications. So a target audience is actually fairly specific. A lot of times people talk about target audiences, and I hear this all the time, like, oh, I want to be reaching, all Americans, or I want to be reaching, governments. That's very broad. So you start thinking about the broad population that you're talking to, and then you think about who actually relates to you and your mission and what you're doing. So getting more and more specific. So this little graphic just talks about kind of going from the whole world and getting more specific. So in the tourism space, I hear a lot that people are like, oh, the whole world's my customers. I'm like, I don't really think that's possible. You don't have the budget or the time or the resources to reach all those people, and those people aren't reachable and don't necessarily care about what you have to say. So if you're thinking about who you're trying to reach and thinking about who's most important to your specific mission and your mandate, here's some examples of who those target audiences might be. I would imagine the general US public, especially for transparency purposes. That's a lot of people. That's 382 million people, roughly, depending on the day. That's way too many people for you to reach, but you might just think that you're communicating to them for transparency purposes or other purposes, given that you're part of the government. But it is helpful to get a little bit more specific on who your actual target audience is. So other people that might be your target audience, depending on what kind of command you are. You might think of military personnel and their families assigned to your command, maybe friends and family of those personnel that might not be on site with you, but is somewhere else and is closely following that news because they care about what's happening there. News media outlets, policymakers, maybe you have partner organizations or it's a different command that's near you or a different branch of the military. You might have vendors that you're trying to reach or that are just curious about what's going on there. Of course, potential recruits, local and city government, according to your command location. So regardless of where you are, the activity there that happens on base, impacts the local community and the city governments, as well as foreign audiences, depending on where you're located. So these are just some examples. They're not meant to be prescriptive. But again, these are also a little too broad. So if you're thinking about those audiences, thinking about what those audiences are like, usually people think in terms of socio-demographics. So the age, income, occupation, family structure, potential ethnic background, religion, education, or income level, maybe their place of residence. So they could be at your command right now, or thinking about their hometown. So those are the basic things that people think about when they think about who your target audience is. But these days, and especially when we're talking about social media, we like to think about our audience more in terms of psychology. And this is really what I encourage my clients to do, to think about who your audience is and what they value, what their behaviors are, what their motivations are. So why do they care about reading your content? What's the purpose behind that? Maybe what their activities are, so what they might be interested in, what their attitudes are, their interests, their lifestyle, and their needs. So I kind of describe it to people as sort of getting in the heads of your audience. So trying to understand the motivation for their consumption of the content, or why they would care about what you have to say from a psychological standpoint. Because content is really a way to connect with your audience and build that brand building and connection. So if you have those goals of maybe reaching local policymakers or other constituents, how are you going to reach them through content? You can't do that unless you really understand them and their needs. So if you're thinking about your target audiences and you're talking about, okay, I have all these people I need to reach, but you need to understand them. You want to think about, yes, the socio-demographics I just talked about, but you really want to focus on psychographics. So focus on value, behaviors, and motivations, and then try to group those people into 3 target audiences with similar motivations and needs. I know that's not, very obvious right away, but it's helpful to really think about who they are and what they might have in common. I don't recommend you having more than 3 target audiences, at least to start out with, because that's actually quite a big lift. If you think about the target audiences being very different, target audiences need different types of content. So the more target audiences you have, the more content that you have to create, and maybe the less efficient your communication strategy will be. So it's helpful to maybe meet with your team, discuss, okay, at this command, we're at a very critical point in time in what we're doing. So our 3 main target audiences would be potentially policymakers, the news media, and military families that are personnel and military families tied to the space, for example. And then you start thinking about what those different values and behaviors and motivations are, so that you can create content that will be relating to them. So I have you think this way before you even get started with your content creation, because knowing your audience allows you to create better content for them, better reach them in different marketing channels, and improve your performance. So if you don't know who your audience is, you don't know what to create for them. So you're probably just blindly creating content because someone tells you to. And while that might check the box for you, that's not really an effective communication strategy. It also helps you decide on your channel strategy. And maybe your channel strategy in the case of your command is a little bit more prescriptive. They say, okay, here, we're just on Facebook and Twitter, and that's what we do. And that's not really for me to say or the topic of this conversation, but it might help you think about, okay, if I am really trying to reach military families and we don't have a Facebook page yet, we might want to be on Facebook because that's where everybody is. Or if we're trying to reach the news media, then maybe LinkedIn and Twitter are better places for that. So just thinking about that. And then of course you want to track your performance. You're not just putting content out in a void. How are we creating content and making sure that that content is performing well and accomplishing your objectives as a public affairs officer or communications person? So I wanted to show an example of how you might put this together and what that looks like. I know that this is a tourism example from Brand USA, but I thought it might help illustrate the point of psychographics. So at Brand USA, and this was a couple of years ago, so I'm sure this has changed since then, we conducted very comprehensive consumer research in I want to say at the time, 20 different countries. And we wanted to ask them, who they were, why they traveled, what motivated them, and really what was going on in their lives to motivate them to travel. And out of those, very heterogeneous 20 different countries, we came up with 3 different personas or target audiences that we were targeting through our work. And as you can imagine, managing, the properties visittheusa.com with 50 states and 5 territories and all this different content, it's hard to create lots of different content for those audiences. And I would imagine, based on all the important work that you're doing out there in the field, there's a lot of different content and a lot of different people to please. So having these kind of personas helps you focus. So out of that research, we came up with 3 different reasons why people travel, or 3 different kind of personality types of travelers. And we were able to create content around that. So the first kind of traveler is the excitement traveler. And as you can see here, these are people that are looking to get out of the routine, to indulge a little bit. These are the travelers that I like to call them city travelers. They're into exciting trips. They want to go to New York City. They want to see the must-sees. They want to go to all, the big places that everyone's been talking about. And they want to escape from their routine. So they're looking for more of like an action-packed vacation. Imagine them, waking up at 8 a.m. and having a checklist of all the things they have to do, and maybe going out late into the night. So this is the excitement traveler. You can imagine that they're motivated by different kinds of content. Then maybe the next kind of traveler, which is the escape traveler. The escape travelers are really the kind of travelers that are interested in trips that are more chill. They're really wanting to be in the outdoors. They're motivated by nature. They might be from countries that are very crowded or don't have a lot of open space. So this is really common in the Japanese market, for example, because they're very densely populated. So they want to be out and about and kind of hang out in nature and just relax. And then the last kind of traveler is what you would call maybe a local traveler. This is a traveler that's really motivated by the culture and kind of getting underneath the skin of a destination. And they really wanted to know more about that destination, and they don't want to have the typical tourist thing. So they're not really the excitement traveler. They're not looking for top 10 things to do in New York City. They're looking for those cool neighborhood spots that you might not find until you've been somewhere for a long time. So these are the 3 different personas. And of course, we basically created our whole content strategy around content for these different personality types and interests and motivations. And so that looked like a lot of different things in our communication channels. But one of the ways that we helped do that is we actually created a content module on our website and kind of guided people through that process. So if you're into cool neighborhoods, you might be a local traveler. And if you're into famed landmarks, maybe you're an excitement traveler. And we created these different types of content to appeal to those travelers while still talking about our main goal, which is to drive visitation and interest in visitation to the United States to support the economy. So this kind of content really performed very well for us, because instead of just talking to everybody in the country in the same way and just making sure the content is translated, we really got behind the motivations of why people travel and served them the kind of content they want to know. So if you're an excitement traveler, you want to know all the famous landmarks because that's how you're going to travel plan. And if you're a local traveler, you want to know about all those cool neighborhoods and kind of finding that bistro, in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. that's really popular or that the locals love. That's going to motivate you. So that's just a little example of why you would really want to define your target audiences and how you might be able to create content for them. So once you think about your content, your audiences, now you want to think about your content strategy. And the audience is just one piece of the content strategy. So what we're talking about today really is content marketing. And I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page and define content marketing. So content marketing is a technique of creating and distributing valuable, relevant, and consistent content to attract and acquire clearly defined audience with the objectives of driving a desired customer action. So it's really your job is to create that valuable, relevant, and consistent content. So those are 3 things that you need to do to make sure that you're providing value to your audience, to make sure that content is relevant to them, and to be consistent. So you're not going to, post 5 posts on Facebook one week and then next week do nothing. And that content will then drive interest with those target audiences and hopefully drive the action that you want. And of course, this is sort of in terms of business because you're kind of looking at them as customers. but you do have customers, you do have stakeholders. So what do you want the stakeholders to do with the information that you're putting out there? How do you want them to react? What's the point of your content? So I always like to start all these kind of presentations with your why. Why are you doing this work? It's not just because you were hired and someone is telling you to do it. You need to have goals and objectives to align your strategy to. So what problems are you trying to solve, or what problems is your command overall happening? This doesn't exist in a silo. So what are you looking at doing? What are your goals? Here are some examples of goals. These are not meant to be prescriptive again, but just think about what your goals might be. And this is very specific to your command and talking to your chain of command and also your team about what kind of goals you might have. So maybe you're at the military branch level and your goal is to attract new recruits, for example, or you're at the command level and you're in the process of doing something extremely important and you want people to know about that work. Maybe you're at a foreign base and you need to communicate COVID-19 protocols from foreign governments to military personnel. Maybe your goal is to instill confidence in the U.S. military and its activities, through transparent content and communication. Maybe your goals might be crisis management and communications, which should be everybody's goal because there's always sort of a crisis going on. If it's not COVID-19, it's something else. So you should always have that in your back pocket. Maybe your goal is to foster community relations. So these are just sort of broad goals. I encourage you to think about that when you're thinking about your strategy. And if you haven't done that yet, it's not a bad time to just take a step back and say, okay, what am I trying to do with my content strategy? Then, of course, you want to match your goals to your resources. You could have these big, lofty goals, but maybe it's just you and you have a very small communication staff and you want to be realistic about what's possible. So goal setting also helps you decide, okay, this is like a triage thing. Maybe this activity is not as important as this one. And if I only have time to do 2 posts this week, what are those posts going to be? And who are my most important target audiences to reach? So this is just also helps you be really efficient with your resources. I can imagine that you don't have hundreds of people working for you. So defining your target audiences and your goals really helps you be more efficient. So I always like to tell people to have SMART goals. What are SMART goals other than sounding fancy and using marketing speak? They're specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So you try to think about your broad goals and then you really try to get down to brass tacks and say, okay, these are my goals. So I just used an example here of what a goal might be during this time. So picking, of course, sort of obvious goal of what's going on right now. Maybe your goal is to inform military families of local COVID-19 protocols. So you're at a overseas command. So that's a good broad goal. So now how are you going to get that done and how are you going to draw down on a content strategy goal? So first you might say, okay, in order to make that happen, I need to add a page to our website, if that's in your purview, which I imagine it might be, to create a COVID-19 landing page with all the relevant local information on your website that's refreshed with new content once a week until 2022. I put in 2022 hoping that maybe we won't have to do this anymore after that, but who knows? I can't see the future, so maybe not. But you see with that goal, it's specific. So you're creating a COVID landing page. It's measurable because you're saying, okay, I'm gonna refresh it with new content once a week. Maybe you won't have new content once a week, but you're gonna look at that page once a week and say, okay, this is still accurate. Nothing has changed. It's attainable because it's just one page and you have the resources to get that done. It's relevant because it goes along with your overall goal and it's very timely for what's going on in the world right now. And then you said, okay, it's time bound. So you're doing it once a week for a year and a half. So you're giving a specific time. Another SMART goal tying to that overall goal is to publish 1 post a week on Facebook and Twitter on COVID-19 related news until 2022. So again, that is a SMART goal, and that's a way to help operationalize your content strategy. So these, again, are just examples you could do with any number of things, but I would encourage you to use this kind of template. So maybe you're brainstorming with your team and you think, okay, my overall goal is to foster community relations. And then you kind of drill that down into more specifics. So how do you foster community relations? What channels do you have? And try to give yourself specific goals so that you can then act on them. So next, when you're trying to think about your content strategy, of course, you want to leverage core values and what we would call in more marketing speak brand values. In the military, you have these core values. So I just included an example of the core values from the Navy. of course, since my husband was Navy, I'm more familiar with the Navy and its operations. So I just included the screenshot. So thinking about what your overall values are of your command, of your organization, that should be really baked into your communication strategy, regardless of who your audience is, because you do still want to be, you still want to be cognizant of your overall messaging, of your overall leadership and change of command, and also, you know, the overall branding. And the Navy has a very strong brand. Different branches of the government, different commands have their own brands, and you want to leverage that work. You don't want to pivot and create something different. This is not the time to do that. So you're thinking about your core values as well when you're creating content strategy. So your posts and content in the back, you know, sort of in the back of your mind should communicate honor, courage, and commitment. Then you want to think about creating a content mission. I tell all of my clients to do this. It really, really helps you focus again and triage. Okay, this is related to what I'm doing here, and this does not relate to what I'm doing here. So a content mission allows you to outline for whom you're creating content and why you're creating it. This also pulls in brand values and overall goals of your organization. So a good content mission should include who you're creating content for, why you're creating it, what types of content you will create roughly, and the desired outcomes. So I know this sounds a little nebulous, so I'll use an example from a recent project I worked on. So I mentioned earlier that I've been working in Belize. So I was hired in January to work with the World Wildlife Fund on creating a brand and marketing strategy for the Belize Barrier Reef, which was a really, you know, very interesting project focused on conservation. So in order for us to focus their efforts, because again, it's a very small team and we're trying to get them to communicate something very specific, we created this content mission for them, which outlines all the different components that I just said. So we're trying to create compelling and scientifically accurate content about the Belize Barrier Reef for Belizeans, tourists and the tourism industry, fisheries, and other key industries to inspire long-term stewardship, responsible tourism, sustainable fisheries, and conservation funding for the Belize Barrier Reef Reserve System World Heritage Site. You can see why we changed the name, because that is quite a mouthful in the logo below. But you can see here that it tells you, okay, my goal if I'm creating content is to create, you know, interesting and accurate content, because again, this is a conservation organization. For Belizeans, so for the Belizean market, for tourism, and for fisheries, because those are three stakeholders that have a big impact on the conservation of the reef. What do we want them to do with this information? Of course, we want them to inspire long-term stewardship, responsible tourism. So we don't want them to just come and pull the fish out of the water and pollute the water and ruin the coral reefs. We want them to do specific things. We still want there to be fisheries, but we want it to be sustainable fisheries. And we also want to make sure that the site is funded so that it could be properly preserved as a World Heritage Site. So this is just an example of how you might take this, a content mission, and apply it to your organization. They can be, you know, fairly simple, but I encourage you to talk to your team and really define this. This is really helpful to have as a barometer for you. When people come in and say, hey, we should be creating content about this, you could say, that's great. That's very interesting, but that doesn't really meet with our mission. And in any case, we're very short staffed, so we don't have the capacity to do all this kind of content. So this is an example of content mission. So when you think about creating your content strategy, you want to think about your goals, your target audiences, and like what they need. The brand pillars, or in the case of the military, you know, your core values, or what your organization stands for, your content mission, and that helps you bring it all together to make a content strategy. So you're really thinking about a bunch of different things. You're not just writing about whatever someone tells you to write about. It's actually a little bit more holistic than that. So I'll just leave this graphic up for a second so you can take a look. And then moving on to a content strategy and what makes a good content strategy. Content strategy at the end of the day, you know, is authentic stories. And given that we're talking mostly about social media, people can tell when stories are inauthentic. So you really want to think about authentic stories that are, you know, human. You're really using content as a bridge to connect with your target audience. So it's a way for you to connect with different audiences and have an emotional reaction with them. I know it's not necessarily always about emotions, but when you're a communication professional, it really is about inspiring action in someone through authentic content. Of course, your content strategy should be tied to your public audience and their needs. So you're not just making content to make content, you're making content to serve a purpose. So it's purpose-driven content and what people actually need, and also, you know, what your organization needs. You want to rely on national assets. So I say this because you kind of want to stay in your lane. So when you're doing your thing at your organization, you want to talk about what you're good at doing. There's other people to talk about other things that are not part of your wheelhouse, and not to say that you shouldn't be creative, but you should really be focusing on what you do best and the purpose of your organization. It's very tempting in the social space to kind of go all over the place, but you want to make sure that you're staying true to yourself. Communicate what makes you different. Share appropriate content only. So this is something I bring up all the time. Once it's out there, it's out there. Even if you delete it, it's still out there. So you really want to think about what's appropriate to share and make sure you seek those proper approvals. So I know in your space, I'm sure this is very well ingrained in you. In a lot of the different other places I work with very sensitive populations. And so, especially with Indigenous communities. So we're careful to say, okay, do we want to talk about this topic? Is it for public consumption or not? So thinking about what that is and also developing that strategy helps you decide, okay, these are the topics that we're going to cover and these are safer topics to communicate. But in any case, of course, you want to follow the proper approvals in your department. Include timely content. So you do have a content strategy and you don't want that to sort of hem you in. It's more to focus you. So if there's other things going on in your life or in the world and you need to talk about them, you can't say, oh, well, I'm not going to talk about this emergency because it's not part of my content strategy. Of course, social media taps into what's going on and you do want to be part of those conversations as appropriate. So you don't want to miss the boat on them, but you do want to include them in your strategy and don't be too rigid. And then, of course, you want to address current concerns. So when things like COVID comes up, you might want to pivot your strategy or even make your strategy a little bit more broad to say, okay, we're going to talk about, any news related things that might impact our military community on base. So those are just some examples. Now, how do we get to the fun part of actually creating your content? So I always like to say content is king, but strategy is queen. So I use a picture of a road here because it really helps you decide where to go. There's so many different directions of where you could go with content, and it is the lifeblood of the internet. It's what is on every channel. So you have Facebook, but without content, you have nothing. You just have an empty page that no one's going to go to. So you really want to think about how your strategy sort of guides you on your path and on your strategy and through your job. So you want to create content strategy in line with your goals. And I encourage people to establish roughly 5 broad themes for your strategy that are repeatable across channels and topics. This will really help you hone in on your strategy. So thinking about, and these are just examples of what a command might do. If you had 5 topics, these are broad topics. These aren't specific articles. So maybe one thing that you always talk about are ceremonies and milestones. So promotion ceremonies, award ceremonies, retirement, really celebrating the accomplishments of your community and of your command. That might be one broad theme. Maybe you have weekly updates or whatever from your commanding officer. So this is where you really have that FaceTime with that person and engage with them on what's going on, and you provide those updates to your community. So that's sort of a regular content franchise. You might want to also have unclassified human interest stories from deployment. So, part of your job as a communication professional is to take this very large organization that seems, very huge and not human of the U.S. military and make it human, because the military is made up of people and their extraordinary efforts and their commitment and determination. So I've seen a lot of channels, as I was preparing for this presentation, do a really good job of pulling out those really compelling stories of different people and their accomplishments and putting a face to the military. That's very effective on social media. Maybe you want to have community relations announcements, so you know that part of your mandate is to really engage with your local constituents. So you have those on a regular basis, and then you might have directives and policy changes for personnel. These are just some examples, but try to pick roughly 5 themes, and you can have 7 if you need to, or 3 if you need to, but try to be a little bit more focused in what you're actually creating so you can help organize yourself and your team. I'm imagining, and I think from what I heard from last year's talk, there's a lot of people that are working by themselves on social media. So having these bright themes will make your lives a lot easier, because you can say, okay, I know there's a ceremony coming up. I'm going to slot that in for Tuesday's content. Or I know we haven't talked to the CEO in a while, so I'm going to talk to the CEO and make sure we have the next couple of months lined up. Okay, so here's an example of, I just wanted to show you an example of very audience specific content. So a while ago, I was, like looking around on social media, and I was targeted with this ad. So being in Washington, D.C., I was advertised with or targeted for Washingtonian's Guide to Los Angeles. So Los Angeles wanted to reach someone who lived in Washington, D.C. So they actually created content that was specifically for them. And as you can imagine, that performed really well. So you can see that now you're in Los Angeles, but they're really comparing things to places that would be in Washington, D.C. So this is just I know this is a tourism example, but it really gets into the head of your audience and say, okay, I'm going to speak to you in the terms that you're related with. So I just like to kind of start with something like this. You get a sense of what that's like. So you really want to map your content strategy to your target audiences. What do they want to know about? What do they care about? And how are you helping them? So if, for example, one of your goals is to communicate information about the current COVID situation, who needs to know about that? Probably military families that are there. So personnel and military families on base. If you're talking about maybe purpose-driven work, or you're at a higher level social media office, maybe at a division level, or even military branch level, maybe you're talking about purpose-driven work. You're trying to talk about the core values of the military. This might be really important to new recruits or the general public. Maybe you're talking about local base activities, so what's going on base, or accomplishments of your base. So that might be interesting content to local government stakeholders or residents. You really want to think about, okay, if you're creating a piece of content, who is that content serving? And that's really what an audience-centric approach to content creation is, which is why you need to know who your target audiences are. So if you're creating content that doesn't serve your core target audiences, maybe it's not worth the time. And of course, if you have vast resources, you might do that. Here's an example from the military. Sorry, this kind of went on its own, it went rogue. So here's a U.S. naval base in Naples, Italy. And as you can imagine, being an American in a foreign country, you might not be always familiar with the different COVID protocols. So this base has been doing a good job keeping their community up to date on what's going on. So they're talking about what's happening in Naples and Italy right now. As you can imagine, they probably lived through a really scary time in Italy about a year ago when there were a lot of cases and the curfew was different. So they used Facebook to communicate, okay, what's going on here? What do you need to know about? They included a link for further resources. That's another thing that's very important. You don't have to be the creator of the content, but you can be the curator of the content. So if you just want to bring the content from the local government to your constituents, that's also great because it's valuable and accurate. But you want to frame that content for them like they are doing here. And they use the hashtag Naples in the Know to aggregate that content all around that topic. And you can tell that this content is very specific to the personnel there because it's written Team Naples. So it's a little bit more friendly. It inspires that, okay, this is for you. And this is a way to support the families there. So thinking about that a little bit, you want to have a plan for how you're creating content. So what content are you creating, what format that content might be in, who that content's being created for, what resources do you need to make that content? So a lot of times people have a good story idea, but they might not have any images or video or even a link to provide them because you need to be providing them value, and things tend to perform better with those additional needs. So maybe if you don't have images or video at that time, you might want to push that content out a little bit later or try to find relevant information to go with it. And then you want to think about what channels that content is going to be communicated on and the best format of content for that channel. So you might have something like this. This is just a screenshot of a simple planning tool that I found on the internet. I actually customize these depending on the client, but you can do whatever you want, whatever works for you. But I recommend having some sort of way that you organize your content, either a scheduling app or a simple Excel spreadsheet or a combination of both. Is just typically what I do with my clients. So a scheduling app for the content, as well as an overarching planning tool. So we usually do a 12-month calendar and a monthly calendar for the different content. And then the individual piece of content are scheduled in whatever tool they use. So I recommend having something like this to really outline your content plan and talk about, okay, who's the target audience? What resources do you need? Should I still be creating this content? Is it relevant right now, or is there something more relevant? It's also helpful just to have a place where you have all your different ideas there, because maybe right now you have tons of things to talk about and there's a lot happening, but maybe in the dead of November, there's nothing to talk about. So you have some stories that are sort of evergreen here that you can pluck out of this worksheet. So I really encourage you to keep a record of all your different ideas, all the content you publish, that really help you organize yourself. This is from Smartsheet, like I said, but this you can use just a simple Excel spreadsheet and put it on a shared drive with your team, whatever you think is best. I also encourage you to have this content types filled in, because maybe you need to create that content. So maybe you need to make that video, or it's not worth the lift for that video, or you need to write that blog or get that photo taken. So work with your local photographer to get that done. So it really helps you map out all the different components of content. So from the initial strategy, taking that into a topic, then moving that over into what kind of content that is, and then the channel, and of course thinking about the angle and the audience that that content serves. So using the same example again, what that could look like on a social level, I like to talk about content franchises with my clients, especially with really small teams that need help organizing themselves. So if you have the overarching 5 topics, how might that translate on social media? So for the Belize Barrier Reef, we gave them 5 days of content topics that tie into also what's happening on the internet and different social trends. So on Monday, we talked about Marine Conservation Mondays. This is a big topic in the conservation space, since the overarching goal of the Belize Barrier Reef brand is to preserve the barrier reef for generations, but also generations to come, but also to help support the Belizean economy and protect them, because it's actually a barrier reef along the coast of Belize. So it actually protects them from storms, which has been, unfortunately very deadly in the Caribbean. So this content is about conservation and talking about climate change, pollution, plastic use, and plastic pollution and habitat destruction. So this is an example of the types of topics that you might talk about on Mondays. So not every Monday, because you might not have the staff to produce content every day of the week. But when you're on Monday, when you're talking about marine conservation, you put that on Monday. On Tuesdays, we talk about travel, and that's of course appropriate for a tourism attraction like the Belize Barrier Reef. So Travel Tuesday is already a popular hashtag. I'm sure you're familiar with other popular hashtags that you might be able to leverage as part of your content strategy. So maybe on Mondays, for you, you might have Motivation Mondays or other Mondays, and you can share some content about your personnel and what they've been accomplishing to tie into overall internet trends. So that's another thing to think about. Travel Tuesday is a popular one. And then on Wednesday, because it's a conservation site, we're talking about wildlife on Wednesday. So this leverages an existing popular hashtag and then talks about the different animals living within the barrier reef and shares some interesting content about it. So it's a very biodiverse place. And of course, people love animals, and that performs well on the internet. So it's almost like a human interest story, but it's actually more about the animals. So people get excited, especially kids. Then on Thursdays, we decided that we really wanted to talk to the Belizean audience. So we're saying, talk about protect what you love. So this is aimed at locals, inspiring them to protect what they love and to take different actions to protect the local environment, like not using plastic, avoiding certain kinds of chemicals. So different sunscreens and beauty products are actually dumped into our oceans, and it's killing coral reef populations. So thinking about taking a shower or using different things before they actually get in the water. And then the last day of the week, we talked about fisheries on Friday. So the Belize Barrier Reef is a very important source of income for fishing populations and also for exports for Belize. And so we're talking about responsible fishing practices, highlighting sustainable fishers, so that human element, and then of course talking about fun recipes for different fish and making sure that people are fishing within the local regulations. So they're fishing when you're supposed to fish for conch and not when you're not supposed to fish for conch, to make sure those populations stay elevated. So here's just an example of what you might do for yourself. I would encourage you to try to do this for every day of the week, especially mapping that to your content, to your target audiences. So maybe on Wednesdays, you try to reach the local population. So, the personnel in your command. Maybe on Tuesdays, you try to reach the media. So thinking about your audiences and the different topics and how you might be able to put that into a little social strategy. You also want to think about creating really important pieces of content that dials into the most important needs of your audiences. And this is where the planning documents and the strategy come in. So maybe there are 2 or 3 pieces of content that you actually produce very well on your website or other channels. And then you think about how that content can be deployed across different channels. So I personally really love the analogy of Thanksgiving turkey. I think that's, well, one, very relatable. But if you think about your content topic as a piece of turkey or a turkey, so let's say the topic, I'm going to kind of beat this dead horse, but let's say the topic is COVID-19 protocols. And so your overall topic is COVID-19 protocols. What that looks like on your website might be different than what that looks like in a weekly Facebook post. But at the end of the day, that's still COVID-19 protocols topic. And so that's still turkey. So maybe you cut up that turkey the day after Thanksgiving and it's a sandwich, and the sandwich goes on Facebook. And the next day, you cut up that turkey and you make it into turkey pot pie, and that's a blog. Or maybe the turkey leg is an infographic. But at the end of the day, the core piece of content is still about COVID-19, so it's still turkey. So I encourage you to think about these content topics like turkey and how you kind of carve up the turkey and then use that turkey in the best format for that channel. So saying, you're slicing up the turkey in thin slices for a sandwich, and that's like creating a video that would perform well on Facebook. And then maybe you're dicing that turkey up into small pieces for a pot pie, and those are little tiny Twitter posts because you're using little pieces of content to publish little snippets of content on the same thing. And then maybe you use the bones to make stock and turkey soup, and that becomes, the basis of your content on your website. And then lastly, you might have some little scraps of turkey left to make turkey salad, and then that would be your infographic, and the infographic will then be populated on different channels. So this is just an example of how you might use your content. This is from LinkedIn. You can see the link here at the bottom if you want to read actually this article. I think it's super helpful. So depending on your command and your goals, you might slice up the turkey in different ways. So if you have at your disposal potentially LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, you might be doing videos for Facebook and Instagram, articles for Twitter, a longer form piece of content for your website, and maybe an infographic for somewhere else. So just thinking about what might be appropriate and, slice and dice your way to content marketing success. I really love this analogy, and I think it's very relevant to what you're doing, and also helps you be very efficient. So you want to make sure that you're investing in good quality content, and then you're carving up that content in the appropriate way for the different channels in a way that would resonate with your audience on those channels. So I wanted to show an example of a content strategy that we worked on with Brand USA. Again, also very relevant. So we spent some time actually updating the travel information on the website. This is actually still there if you want to look at it. So if you go to visittheusa.com, you can navigate yourself to travel information. We felt that the information was very lacking, and our target audiences were very confused about the entry procedures and protocols of coming to the US. So we looked at all of that content and really rewrote that content. And then we made a section for travel alerts. So this is a space where they can hear about timely things that are happening. And so, of course, right now, there's coronavirus updates there. Once we decided on what that content would be, we actually talked to all of the different markets to then further customize that content into information that is more specific to that audience and serving the needs of that audience. So we actually took all that content. It was quite a lot of content. I want to say like 20 different articles with very specific links. And we went to each market or to our partner in that market, and we then created the content. So we translated it, of course, but then we contextualized it for that audience. So here's a screenshot of the French page. And we talked about, okay, so a French tourist would care about which things, what are their concerns, how can we create the content that would better serve them and make it more useful. And then we updated that content and published it. And so now that's being continued with COVID-19, but that content always remains. So if you're thinking about serving your multiple audiences, you might have one piece of content, but it might be packaged and framed differently based on your different target audiences. So it's very important to touch base with those audiences. If you're close with media outlets or other people, ask them, how the content's performing, and try to update that content. The beauty of being in the digital space is that you can actually change things and make updates. I started my content career actually at magazines. And I remember, when we produced the magazine, the anxiety that you'd have like right before you hit publish and you send it to the printer, you're like, if there's anything wrong, you can't change anything. Well, in the digital space, you can go on your website, you can update things, you can pivot your communication strategy halfway through if it's not working. So that brings me to a really important topic that I'm just going to cover really quickly is measurement. So how are you evaluating your content strategy? This, like I said, could be a whole topic on its own, but there's lots of things for you to measure. This really depends on your goals, which is why I encourage you to have objectives at the beginning. So if you have a goal of getting a certain engagement or reach, which we would call key performance indicators, that would be tied to your SMART goals, which we talked about up front. Here are some examples of different metrics that you might have. So maybe you want to have a reach or engagement, or maybe your metric just to start out is actually getting that content published. But here are some examples that you might have of what you want to measure. And then you want to think about what those indicators are and how you're going to measure your success. So is that content performing well? Should we be adjusting things? Was that post that we spent a lot of time on, was that tone deaf, or did people get it? So thinking about using those analytics that are actually built into your social media, which I'm not going to go into now, to improve your strategy so that you can test and learn. So I wanted to close out with just a few good practices when it comes to content. There are a lot of them, but these are just the ones that I like to mention. So you want to make sure you have well-researched, accurate content. I can't tell you how many times I see things with not just grammatical errors, but that are just wrong. If you're trying to be an accurate source of information, you need to make sure that your content is accurate. So take the time to do that, or don't publish it. So get it approved, of course, but you want to make sure that you're communicating information that is currently up to date or as you know it. You want to make sure that your content provides value to your audience. So of course you have your overarching goals of what you're trying to accomplish, but you're serving an audience. And so what do you want the audience to do with that information and how you're providing value to them? You want to make sure you have the proper approvals for your content and use the appropriate language, of course. You want to have the content formatted for the proper channel, which I'm sure that you all know very well and do this every day. You want to make sure that content is updated over time. So don't create a piece of content, especially on your website, and leave it there to have inaccurate information. Scrub that content. If you are also managing your website, which I don't know if you are or not, make sure you look at that, even if you're just the social media manager, which I don't want to say just the social media manager because that's very busy. And I'm sure that you have a lot on your plate. Look at the content on your website and nudge your colleague to say, hey, I can't communicate XYZ thing because actually this content is out of date. So it's everyone's job to make sure that that's being done. Of course, then you want to think about utilizing hashtags for social, but then also thinking about keywords. So if you're really trying to get in to penetrate a certain audience, maybe you should be looking into your SEO strategy, which could be a whole other topic. But just to bring that up, depending on what channels you are on and what your goals are, then you want to include the best possible imagery or visuals to support that story. So I always like to think of having the image first when I'm thinking of a topic, because it's hard to put that out there, especially on social, without a compelling image that pulls people in, that creates that emotional connection and drives them to want to learn more. And then you want to connect with your audience with a relatable tone and voice. I've seen some accounts do a really great job of this. They can be really funny and relatable without being too casual or irreverent. So you still want to stay true to your overall voice and brand, but this is a human channel. You need to act like a human, not a robot. And I say that with love, but sometimes people's content, it's just a little too stale and it's not performing well because you're not talking to other people. At the other end of a channel is a human. So I'm using Twitter to talk to another person. So just remember that when you're creating content and putting it out there. So just wrapping up, you want to define your target audiences. Your content is king and your strategy is queen. You want to create content in response to their needs. Develop important content and carve it up in relevant ways, like the Thanksgiving turkey. Make sure your content is up to date. And like always, test and learn. Don't stick with the plan if it's not working. Change your plan. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. I hope you got some value out of this conversation. And here's my email if you have any other questions. Okay, so I'm done now.
Oh, that was awesome, Talia. I do have one quick question.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned like scheduling platforms. Are there any scheduling platforms that you like suggest or recommend as far as content is concerned?
Yeah, so I would say the platforms depend on your channels because I think certain platforms actually have um, they're better for different channels. So in the tourism space, I use Later a lot because I think Later works really well on Instagram, and Instagram is really important for tourists. This is very visual. If you're on Twitter, people like Buffer or Hootsuite. Sometimes you want to use a combination of publishing natively and with a scheduling tool. There's a ton of scheduling tools. So I hate to pick out just a few, but you need to figure out sort of your marketing stack and what's going to work for you. So maybe it's a combination of using an Excel or a shared drive, or maybe you have some resources like I think most people use Microsoft Office and Teams. So there's some collaboration tools in there that I would consider leveraging. And then using the different scheduling apps. What I really like about some of them, like Later, is it actually allows you to upload your content library. And so sometimes if I'm having trouble coming up with different pieces of content, I can actually share my screen and show that if you want to see it really quick.
That's true.
So if I go into Later, I'm just going to show one of my clients' pages. You can see here that, oh, hold on. I need to share my screen, of course, for that. Let's do that. Okay, so if I'm going into Later, this is my client, Aquasasani Travel. They've actually put all their content in here, or like the content that we're using right now. So I can see the different content here and decide, okay, it's Wednesday, and on Wednesday we talk about art. I see this, there's the content of the baskets that one of their artisans made. It has media information about that content, so like where it was shot, when it was shot, different notes, and then you can drag it onto the day of the week and then write the caption and then customize it for Facebook and Instagram. So I've really liked using Later specifically for the tourism purposes. We don't use Twitter that much, but I know that Twitter is an important channel for the military. So I would encourage you to look at your channel strategy and then see which platforms are best for you. And also do a bunch of free trials. I actually tried Later for free for a month before I encouraged the team to buy it. And I think almost all of these softwares let you try it. I don't know what the security optics of that looks like, because I think on base it's a little bit harder to just go onto random softwares and enter passwords. But maybe at home, you can dabble into different channels with your own personal social channels and see which ones are going to work best for your needs. And then once you've learned that this one is the best mix for you, get that approved through appropriate channels at work. But sign up for your own free trials. Some of it's a little bit personal, I think, and then of course platform specific.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and I think it'll be really, really helpful. And of course, you left your email, so you probably get some emails from some of the people out there as well.
Wonderful. Well, it's so nice to virtually meet you, but non-meet you. So just hopefully this was helpful to you all, and I wish you luck and good health for the year to come.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thanks.